Why did settlers who had money for boards and nails freeze to death, while the poor in their dugouts survived? In the winter of 1886, temperatures on the Great Plains dropped so low that mercury froze in thermometers and the wind pierced through standard wooden structures. People who had built beautiful Eastern-style frame houses were horrified to discover that their homes had turned into ice traps, unable to retain heat. At the same time, their neighbors, sheltered under layers of turf and coarse earth, sat warm and safe, listening to the wind howling somewhere far above. This architecture of despair, born of a lack of choice, turned out to be the perfect machine for survival in an extreme climate. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary grass with roots became stronger than brick and why earthen walls save sanity better than the strongest wood. What if I told you that everything you believed about construction was wrong? We are used to thinking that thick wooden logs or brickwork are the benchmark for reliability and protection from the cold. However, on the windswept plains, where the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero, wood froze in a matter of hours, turning the house into a refrigerator. Earthen walls, on the other hand, possessed a property that engineers call thermal inertia, but settlers simply called salvation. A layer of densely packed earth 1 meter thick not only insulated the room from the outside environment, it also acted as a heat accumulator. During the day, when the sun warmed the outside a little, or when the stove was lit inside, the earthen blocks slowly absorbed the heat. At night, when the outside temperature dropped to deadly levels, the wall began to release the accumulated heat back into the room. This created a unique microclimate where temperature fluctuations were minimal, unlike in wooden houses, where by morning the water in a bucket would turn to ice. The settlers quickly realized that their survival depended not on the beauty of the facade, but on the thickness of the earthen rampart between them and the blizzard. The harsher the winter, the more they appreciated these gloomy, dark, but warm burrows. The turf construction eliminated any gaps through which the icy wind could penetrate and blow away all the heat. In a wooden house, the boards dried out and warped, creating drafts that were impossible to combat. The earth, on the other hand, was monolithic, settling and compacting under its own weight, sealing any openings better than any construction foam. This principle of massiveness had been used for centuries, but it was in the Wild West that it reached its absolute peak of effectiveness. People literally wrapped themselves in a blanket of soil, realizing that nature would not spare those who decided to argue with it. They did not try to isolate themselves from the landscape. They became part of it, merging with the terrain. The most amazing thing is that such a wall could breathe, regulating the humidity inside the room in a natural way. In a wooden house with a strong furnace, the air became unbearably dry, but in an earthen shelter, the balance was maintained. This was important for lung health, especially in conditions where people did not go outside for months. Of course, life inside an earthen rampart required a special disposition and a willingness to put up with the constant feeling of heaviness overhead. But when the white death raged outside, aesthetics took a back seat to the pure physics of survival. Interestingly, many who survived those winters remembered their earthen homes fondly, despite the dirt and dampness. They understood that it was this primitive technology that had saved their lives when civilized methods had failed. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. Could you live through a winter in such a house for the sake of safety? Write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the pioneers' first home looked like? It wasn't a beautiful log cabin, which we often see in classic westerns about the settlement of new lands. The first thing a family did when they arrived at their plot of land was often to build a temporary shelter called a dugout or dugout house. They would find a steep slope on a hill or ravine and simply dig into it with shovels, creating a cave. This was the fastest way to get a roof over their heads with virtually no building materials. The whole process took only a few days, which was critical if the family arrived in the fall, just before the cold weather set in. They did not need to cut down trees, which were simply not available on the prairie, or wait for bricks to be delivered. The only tools they used were a sharp shovel and a pickaxe, and the only material was the earth beneath their feet. The front wall of such a dugout was usually laid with layers of turf or, if lucky, stones, leaving an opening for the door. The roof was formed directly from the top layer of soil of the hill, which made the structure incredibly stable. Inside such a cave, it was always dim, as there were either no windows or they were tiny and covered with oiled paper. But it was this depth into the ground that provided the very protection from the wind that the inhabitants of the plains dreamed of. The wind simply blew over the hill, encountering no resistance from the vertical walls, and did not cool the dwelling. It was an ideal aerodynamic shape, created not by calculations, but by nature itself. However, living in such a burrow was psychologically difficult, as people were effectively underground. The walls could crumble, and during rains, water often found its way inside, turning the floor into a dirty mess. Nevertheless, for thousands of families, this stage was a necessary initiation into life on the edge of civilization. It was a test of endurance, a test of how much a person wanted to stay on this land. Many used these dugouts as cellars or sheds after they had built more substantial houses. But in the first most terrible winter, it was the hole in the hill that became an ark of salvation. Do you think this dwelling is more like a tomb or a fortress? In the next chapter, you will learn the secret of the roof, which could weigh several tons but did not fall on people's heads. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the strength of these amazing structures. The biggest mystery for modern man remains how the roofs of these houses did not collapse under the enormous weight of earth and snow. Engineers of the time were amazed, but the answer lies in the unique root system of steppe grass, which acted as the most reliable reinforcement. Special types of grasses grew in this area, which over centuries formed a dense surface layer of soil. The roots of local plants were so long, dense, and intertwined that even a very strong person could not tear the turf layer with their hands. This natural grass mat had a tensile strength comparable to high-quality modern synthetic materials. When the pioneers laid layers of turf on the roof, they were actually creating a complex composite material reinforced by millions of natural fibers. The logs supporting the roof could sag under the weight over time, but the turf carpet itself retained its shape thanks to this incredible intertwining of roots. The roof construction was multi-layered and thought out to the smallest detail, because the life of the family depended on it. A layer of loose soil or clay was often poured on top of the turf to cover all possible joints and provide additional insulation. Over time, the grass on the roof continued to grow, and the roots of neighboring blocks began to grow together even more tightly. Gradually, the entire structure turned into a single living organism, which only became stronger with each passing year. In spring, such a roof turned green and bloomed with wildflowers, camouflaging the dwelling so that it could not be seen from a distance of 100 meters. This gave an unexpected tactical advantage, as the house blended completely into the landscape without disturbing the centuries-old harmony of the wild steppe. Sometimes animals even wandered onto such roofs to graze, and the owners could hear the footsteps of cows right above their heads. However, this living roof also had a serious downside, which is not usually romanticized in books. During prolonged autumn rains, the turf roof worked insidiously, absorbing water like a giant earthen sponge. The weight of the wet roof increased several times over, creating a colossal load on the supporting beams and walls of the house. The inhabitants of such houses lived in constant fear of collapse and watched the ceiling sag every rainy day. They had to put up additional thick supports in the center of the room during heavy storms to prevent the beams from cracking. It was a constant balancing act on the brink of disaster and a struggle for survival, but the settlers simply had no alternative due to the lack of other materials. If it rained for several days in a row, water inevitably began to seep through the thickness of the earth and drip into the room. The most unpleasant thing was that the roof continued to leak for several days even after the rain had stopped outside. Mud fell from the ceiling directly onto plates of food, clean clothes, and people sleeping in their beds. The housewives resorted to all sorts of tricks to somehow maintain comfort in this dirty chaos. The women stretched wide sheets of light-colored fabric or gauze under the ceiling to catch falling clumps of earth, insects, and drops of muddy water. This fabric formed a kind of second ceiling, which had to be periodically removed and shaken out to remove the accumulated dirt. But as soon as the rainy season ended and the hot steppe sun came out, the roof dried out, once again becoming a reliable and warm shelter. This endless, natural cycle of wetting and drying made the turf even denser and harder. Over time, under the influence of the sun and wind, the earth on the roof baked, turning it into something like solid stone. Like this if you are amazed by the ingenuity of people who use grass instead of concrete. Guess how long it took one family to build this unique home from scratch? Building a full-fledged sod house, or soddy as they were called, was hard physical labor, comparable to building a stone fortress by hand. This was no longer just a temporary burrow dug into the hillside, but a separate, substantial building. Its walls were made of thousands of specially cut earthen blocks, which were laid with precision. The main tool used here was a special plow called a grasshopper because of its unique shape and the sound it made when cutting through roots. This plow cut the turf into perfectly even long strips about half a meter wide. These long strips of earth were then cut with a sharp shovel into individual bricks of standard size. Each brick weighed about 20 and sometimes 40 kilograms, depending on the moisture content of the soil. To build even a small house, it was necessary to cut, transport, and lift about 3,000 or 4,000 such bricks by hand. It was exhausting work in which the whole family participated, from small children to the elderly. Neighbors often came to help, organizing joint construction days, because it was almost impossible to lift heavy walls alone. To build one average house, it was necessary to completely remove the top layer of soil from an area of about 1 acre. The turf was laid strictly with the grass facing down, so that the roots of the top layer would intertwine with the soil of the bottom layer, creating traction. Builders used a bricklaying technique with jointing to ensure that the wall was monolithic and would not fall apart. Each row was carefully leveled, checked for verticality, and the joints were carefully filled with loose soil for complete tightness. The walls were made very thick, often 2 or 3 rows of bricks, which gave a total base width of almost a meter. Such incredible thickness was necessary not only to preserve heat during the harsh winter. Thick walls were needed primarily to withstand the enormous weight of the earthen roof, which we mentioned earlier. Window and door openings were the weakest point of the structure, so they were reinforced with strong wooden frames. These frames were installed first and then carefully covered with turf, tightly fitting the bricks. Over time, the heavy house settled significantly, with the walls sinking several inches in the first year. Therefore, wise builders always left a special gap above the door and window frames, filled with soft grass or rags. If this compensation gap had not been left, the settling wall would simply have crushed the valuable window frame with its weight. There were cases when the door jammed shut and the owners found themselves locked in their own house. This was important engineering knowledge gained from the bitter experience of the first unsuccessful constructions and collapses. After the wall had settled, it was often leveled from the inside with a sharp shovel, cutting off protruding roots and unevenness, like butter with a knife. Some wealthy owners even plastered the walls with clay or whitewashed them with lime, if they could get hold of it and bring it in. Whitewashing not only made the house brighter, but also got rid of the feeling that you were living inside a tomb. Such a house was a real impregnable fortress for its inhabitants in the harsh conditions of the Wild West. It did not burn in steppe fires, its walls could not be shot through with an Indian bow or even a rifle. It stood unshakable in the middle of an endless ocean of grass, a symbol of human perseverance in the struggle against nature. Inside, it was cool on the hottest summer days and surprisingly warm in the winter cold thanks to the thick earthen walls. But how did these people keep warm inside when there was not a single tree for firewood for miles around? In the next chapter, you will learn what they used to heat their stoves in a land where only grass grows. The problem of heating in the treeless steppe was even more acute than the problem of building the dwellings themselves. The usual firewood was a real luxury here, available only to those lucky ones who managed to occupy land near the rare rivers overgrown with willows and poplars. For the vast majority of the other settlers, the only source of heat was what was literally lying at their feet. There were no trees for hundreds of miles around, and people had to be incredibly resourceful to keep from freezing in the harsh winters. The main fuel of the American frontier was so-called bison chips, sun-dried bison dung, and in later years, cattle dung. Collecting this specific fuel was the direct responsibility of children and women, who roamed the countryside all day with large bags or wheelbarrows. This activity was often turned into a kind of game, where children competed to see who could find the largest and driest piece. Surprisingly, dry dung burned beautifully, producing an even, hot flame and emitting almost no unpleasant odor, which was so feared by beginners. It smoldered very slowly, like high-quality peat or coal, which allowed the cast iron stove to maintain a stable heat throughout the long winter night without the need to constantly add fuel. Another common and affordable type of fuel was grass itself, which was abundant in the surrounding area. Simply throwing hay into the stove was pointless, as it burned in a second, so the grass was twisted into very tight bundles, similar to solid logs. These grass cats, as they were popularly called, still burned fairly quickly, so they had to be harvested in truly enormous quantities. Huge stacks of twisted grass took up all the free space around the house because winters were unpredictable. Over time, local blacksmiths even invented special devices for mechanically twisting hay to make this exhausting process faster and more efficient. A person could spend a whole day simply turning the handle of such a press and turning grass into fuel briquettes to provide their family with warmth for at least one evening. In some fortunate areas, settlers managed to find brown coal deposits right on the surface of the earth, but this was a rare stroke of luck, similar to winning the lottery. Much more often, any plant debris was used, and people had to burn dry, hard corn stalks or sunflower heads if the harvest in the fields had already been completely gathered. The stoves in sod houses were usually quite small in order to save as much of the precious and hard-to-obtain fuel as possible. However, thanks to the excellent insulation of the thick earthen walls, even a small fire in the hearth was enough to raise the temperature in the room to a comfortable level. Families quickly learned to use the heat they got as efficiently as possible, trying to do several things at once. Housewives always cooked meals, baked bread, and heated water for washing at the same time while the stove was lit. In this harsh land, not a single spark of heat could be wasted, as the survival of the entire family depended on it. Even the waste from combustion was put to use, demonstrating waste-free production in action. The ashes from burning grass and manure were carefully collected and used by housewives to make homemade alkaline soap or as valuable fertilizer for their meager vegetable gardens. It was a completely closed life cycle where nothing was thrown away and every little thing had its purpose. Life harshly taught the settlers to see valuable resources where pampered city dwellers saw only useless trash under their feet. It was this amazing ability to adapt and find unconventional solutions out of nothing that allowed them to survive and raise children in the wild steppe. What I am about to show you is prohibited in 12 countries in modern construction, but back then it was the absolute norm. The airtightness of turf houses, which so reliably protected people from the bitter cold, concealed a hidden deadly threat that many discovered too late. Thick earthen walls caulked with grass, in the complete absence of a well-designed ventilation system, turned a cozy dwelling into a veritable gas chamber if the stove malfunctioned. People sought to seal their homes as tightly as possible to keep the heat in, but this played a cruel joke on them. Carbon monoxide, an insidious killer with no color or smell, gradually accumulated in low and cramped rooms. It silently killed entire families in their sleep, and neighbors only discovered them several days later. In the small interior of the dugout, life-giving oxygen burned out very quickly, especially if the owners closed the stove damper early in an attempt to preserve the remaining heat until morning. This was a common mistake made by novices who did not understand the physics of air exchange in such a dense space. The paradox was that the small drafts that the inhabitants of the steppes fought so fiercely often saved their lives. Random cracks in dried-out doors or poorly fitted frames provided the minimum flow of fresh air that was necessary for people to breathe and for the fire to burn. In winter, the situation became critical when the walls were covered with a thick layer of frost on the inside and the door was blocked by thick snow on the outside. Natural air exchange through the pores of the earth ceased almost completely, turning the house into an airtight tin can. People often woke up with severe headaches, weakness, and nausea, attributing this to fatigue or poor food. They did not understand that they were literally on the verge of death and that they urgently needed fresh air. Experienced settlers who had lived in the steppe for several years knew that it was necessary to periodically ventilate the room, even if it was freezing outside. They opened the door briefly, letting in a thick cloud of frosty steam, which refreshed the stale and dangerous air. Another huge problem was the constant high humidity, which inevitably contributed to the active growth of black mold and fungus. Dampness was a constant presence in the earthen walls, and it was almost impossible to get rid of it completely, no matter how much they heated the stove. The damp air caused many lung diseases, and children who grew up in such houses often suffered from chronic coughs, bronchitis, and rheumatism from an early age. This was the high price people paid for protection from instant death in the cold. The slow destruction of their health by constant dampness. Animal fat candles and primitive oil lamps also actively burned precious oxygen, adding acrid soot to the already heavy air inside the dwelling. The ceilings above the dining table were always completely black from greasy soot that was impossible to wash or wipe off. But despite all these hidden dangers and inconveniences, an earthen house remained the only real chance to survive the endless winter. Every day, people chose between the risk of suffocating from smoke and the guarantee of freezing to death in the open field. And the choice was obvious to everyone. What do you think was scarier, invisible gas or visible blizzards? In the next chapter, you will learn how they protected the most vulnerable parts of their homes, the windows. The windows in turf houses were the most expensive and most vulnerable element of the entire structure, so their installation was treated with particular trepidation. Glass on the frontier cost a fortune, as it had to be transported hundreds of kilometers from the nearest railway stations. Transporting fragile cargo in carts over rough terrain was a real feat, and many sheets simply did not reach their destination intact. It was precisely because of the high price and the risk of breaking the precious material that the windows were made very small. They tried to embed them deeply into thick earthen walls to protect them from hail and strong winds. Often, there were only one or two small windows in a house, located high above the ground. This was dictated not only by economy, but also by safety considerations. Due to the enormous thickness of the walls made of layers of turf, the windowsills were incredibly wide. Sometimes they reached a meter in depth, becoming a full-fledged part of the interior of a cramped dwelling. Housewives quickly found a use for this space, trying to make the most of every inch. These deep niches were used as convenient shelves for storing all sorts of things. Books were kept here, if the family had any, as well as sewing tools and dishes. In the spring, boxes with seedlings were placed on the wide windowsills to catch the rare rays of sunshine. Sometimes they even arranged additional seating there, especially if there were many children in the house. From the outside, such a window resembled a narrow embrasure of an impregnable fortress, securely hidden in an earthen rampart. It looked like a dark abyss, unreachable for enemy arrows or the raging elements of the prairies. The very architecture of the house suggested that its inhabitants were always ready for defense. Very little light penetrated through such a long tunnel, even on the clearest sunny day. The rays were lost along the way, scattering off the earthen slopes, so the far corners of the room were always in semi-darkness. Women often had to do delicate work, such as mending clothes, sitting close to the glass. Those who could not afford real glass had to look for affordable substitutes. Poor families used thick paper generously soaked in lard or oil. Another option was thin tanned animal skin or a bladder stretched over a frame. Such primitive material allowed only dim, yellowish light into the dwelling. It was impossible to see the street through it. Only vague shadows and outlines of objects were visible. This created the feeling that the house was constantly shrouded in thick fog, separating the family from the rest of the world. This window design created a feeling of complete isolation, especially during the long and harsh winter months. People lived as if in a closed capsule, unable to see the horizon or the familiar landscape. They had to orient themselves in time of day only by the faint changes in light inside the room. In winter, if the owners did have windows, they would instantly freeze through. Due to the temperature difference between the warm room and the frosty street, they would become covered with a thick layer of ice on the inside. This icy shell was so thick that it completely blocked the already limited view. In order to catch a glimpse of the street and check the weather, people had to resort to a trick. They heated a copper coin over a fire and pressed it against the frozen glass. The heat of the metal melted a small round hole through which it was possible to see a piece of the snow-covered plain. The doors were made of the strongest boards that could be found in the treeless steppe. Often it was wood from dismantled carts or boxes, which was guarded like the apple of one's eye. For additional warmth and protection from drafts, The door leaf was often covered with bison or deer skins on the inside. The door was always placed on the leeward side, taking into account the wind direction in the area. This was vital to ensure that the exit from the house was not blocked by a snowdrift after a heavy snowstorm. Otherwise, the family risked being trapped in their own home for several days. To conserve precious heat, double doors were often installed, or a small vestibule was added. This corridor, also made of pieces of turf, served as a buffer zone between the street and the living room. Firewood, work tools, and outerwear were stored there. This unique airlock allowed people to enter and exit the house without cooling down the main living area. Cold air was trapped in the vestibule, preventing it from immediately reaching the hearth and sleeping areas. This significantly saved fuel, which was always in short supply in the step. Locks and hinges were primitive, as factory-made fittings were difficult and expensive to buy. Hinges were often made from old leather soles or forged by hand by a local blacksmith, if there was one nearby. Doors were usually locked with a simple wooden bolt that securely blocked the door from the inside. But the main protection for the inhabitants was not a wooden bolt or a clever lock. The very impregnability of the thick earthen walls, which neither bullets nor fire could penetrate, served as a guarantee of safety. The house blended into the landscape, becoming invisible to the outside eye. These small loophole windows became a symbol of the settlers' wary gaze at the wild world around them. They looked out over the endless plain, ready to repel danger at any moment. The floor in most sod houses was simply the compacted earth on which the dwelling stood. This seems primitive to modern man, but the settlers developed whole technologies for turning ordinary soil into a reliable covering. It was impossible to simply leave the loose earth, otherwise the house would turn into a muddy swamp. The process of creating a floor required enormous physical effort from the entire family. The earth was watered abundantly, mixed with wood ash, and sometimes clay was added for binding. Then this mixture was tamped down long and hard with heavy wooden blocks, or the ends of logs. After completely drying, such a floor was transformed beyond recognition. It became hard and smooth, almost like concrete screed or natural stone. You could walk on such a surface without sinking, and it could withstand the weight of massive homemade furniture. Caring for such a floor was surprisingly easy and convenient for the housewife. It could be easily swept with a broom, collecting debris and crumbs. A properly made earthen floor did not dust as much as ordinary dry soil in a field. Clever housewives knew a special secret for polishing earthen floors to a mirror-like shine. They used fat left over from cooking or soapy water left over from washing, rubbing it regularly into the surface. It was painstaking work that required patience and strong hands. Over time, thanks to this treatment, the earth became saturated and resembled tanned leather. The surface began to slightly reflect the light of a fire or lamp, creating a cozy atmosphere in the house. Such a well-maintained floor was a woman's pride and an indicator of her skill. However, in the spring, when the snow melted and the groundwater level rose, problems began. The floor could become damp, cold, and in the worst cases, even begin to let mud seep through from below. Living on damp ground was hazardous to health, especially for small children and the elderly. To combat the dampness and cold coming from the ground, people came up with various tricks. They laid thick, woven mats made of steppe grass or straw on the floor. Old rags and burlap were also used to create at least some kind of layer between the feet and the ground. Wealthy settlers, of course, dreamed of having real wooden flooring in their homes. But in the treeless plains, wood for flooring was an unaffordable, almost royal luxury. Each board had to be transported by train and then by cart for hundreds of miles. Lumber often cost more than all the other property in the house combined, including livestock. Therefore, wooden floors appeared in sod houses only after years of hard work. Until then, the family walked on the same ground they cultivated outside. Dirt was a constant companion in life, and dealing with it took up a significant part of women's time. Clumps of clay, dust, and dry grass were constantly being carried in from the street, threatening to turn the dwelling into a pigsty. Keeping a house with an earthen floor clean was a never-ending Sisyphean task. In front of the entrance to each house, there was always a special iron or wooden shoe scraper. Everyone entering was required to thoroughly clean their soles so as not to drag extra dirt inside. This rule was strictly enforced, and children were punished for breaking it. Life on an earthen floor dictated its own strict rules of hygiene and organization of daily life. Heavy furniture could not simply be placed on the ground, as it would eventually begin to sink. The legs of cabinets and tables were placed on special wide pads made of planks or flat stones. People usually slept on significant elevations, trying to be as far away from the cold floor as possible. This also protected them from insects, such as fleas, which often lived in the earthen foundation. Beds rarely had legs. More often, they were bunks, firmly nailed directly into the earthen walls of the house. Despite its primitiveness and obvious disadvantages, the earthen floor had its unexpected advantages. It never creaked underfoot, allowing you to move around the house completely silently. In addition, such a covering was completely fireproof, which was important when heating with an open fire. A coal that accidentally fell from the stove or a spark from a torch could not cause a fire. On a wooden floor, this could have led to tragedy, but here the coal simply extinguished on the cold ground. This was a huge advantage far from fire brigades and large water supplies. It was life in direct contact with the earth, in the most literal sense of the word. People walked on the same material that the walls and roof of their house were made of. The Great Plains are notorious for their destructive winds, capable of blowing away a light frame house in seconds. Here, where the wind races for hundreds of miles without a single obstacle, wooden structures often blew apart like houses of cards. But sod buildings possessed an amazing, almost mystical resistance to tornadoes and storm winds. Their low profile and streamlined shape caused the wind to bend around the obstacle, rolling smoothly over the roof rather than pressing against the wall with all its might. The weight of the sod blocks made the walls inert to gusts of wind of absolutely any force. Each cubic foot of such a wall weighed dozens of kilograms, and even the most violent hurricane was powerless to move this mass. Where a normal wooden house would be torn from its foundations and smashed to pieces, the dugout stood unshakable. It resembled a huge boulder embedded in the ground or a natural hill, indifferent to the storm. During a tornado, when the horizon turned black and a deadly funnel appeared, the safest place was inside such an earthen fortification. The settlers quickly realized this and did not run into the field, but instead hid deep inside their homes. They knew that their unsightly dark houses were their only salvation from the wrath of the heavens. In fact, the sod house itself was a large and reliable storm shelter. The roof, held down by the enormous weight of the earth and turf, could not be torn off by the wind, as was often the case with the light roofs of frame houses. The roof structure weighed several tons, and this weight played into the hands of the inhabitants. It lay like a dead weight, pressing the walls tightly against the foundation and preventing the structure from collapsing. Even the powerful lifting force of a tornado could not overcome this gravity. Of course, damage did occur, but it mainly affected the weak points of the structure. Even if hurricane-force winds knocked out windows or tore flimsy doors off their hinges, the load-bearing structure of the house remained intact. Repairing openings, boarding up a window, or hanging a new door was a matter of a few hours' work. At the same time, neighbors who lived in fashionable plank cottages were often forced to gather the remains of their property across the steppe for miles around. Earthen walls had another important property. They excelled at dampening the noise of the storm. In a wooden house, the howling wind, creaking beams, and rumbling blows could drive one mad, causing panic and terror. Inside the dugout, however, it was relatively quiet and calm, with sounds muffled as if by thick cotton wool. The family could sit by the hearth in silence, even when all hell was breaking loose outside and the elements were raging. This physical security gave people the psychological sense of protection they needed in the face of a force of nature they could not control. Living in an ocean of grass with nowhere to hide, knowing that the walls would hold allowed them to sleep peacefully. They understood that they had built not just a house for the night, but a real bunker designed for war with nature. And in this war, their earthen fortress most often emerged victorious. However, the low profile of the houses had a downside, which became apparent in winter. Sometimes after a heavy snowstorm, people had to literally dig their way out with shovels from the inside. A house standing low to the ground was covered with snow or sand up to the roof, turning it into a snowdrift. But the settlers considered this a minor inconvenience compared to the fact that the house remained standing. Wind resistance was not an accident, but a kind of evolutionary advantage of this type of housing. People, perhaps unconsciously, copied the principles used by animals that dug burrows for protection. Nature itself suggested the shape and material that could withstand its fury. It was an example of the ideal adaptation of architecture to extreme environmental conditions. It was these houses that allowed people to settle and survive in areas that had long been considered unsuitable for civilized human life. Without them, the colonization of the Great American Desert could have been delayed for decades or not happened at all. They became reliable anchors, holding civilization at the very edge of the world. Life in an underground house was a severe test not only for the body, but also for the human psyche. The feeling of constant oppression, low, overhanging ceilings, and a chronic lack of sunlight weighed heavily on the mind. The eyes grew tired from the perpetual gloom, and the lungs from the stale air. Some settlers, especially women accustomed to the spacious and bright houses of the East, fell into deep depression. For many, the move from a cozy wooden cottage to an earthen burrow was a real culture shock, from which not everyone was able to recover. The silence inside the thick walls could be deafening, creating a frightening feeling of complete detachment from reality. It seemed as if the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving only this endless steppe. People were left alone with their heavy thoughts in a dark room that smelled of damp earth. In those days, doctors and writers even had a special term for it: steppe madness. The cramped, gloomy dugouts played a significant role in the development of this condition. People spent months in a confined space, staring at the same gray walls. The inability to be alone and the constant presence of other family members in a small space made the situation extremely tense. The walls from which beetles and worms sometimes crawled out or plant roots sprouted were a constant reminder that nature was very close. It was not like living in a sealed house. It was like living with the soil. This blurred the usual boundary between home and the wild steppe, depriving people of their sense of civilized comfort. It seemed as if the earth was slowly trying to swallow its inhabitants. But on the other hand, these same walls provided an unexpected feeling of maternal protection, a shelter in the womb of the earth. When the icy wind howled outside, it was warm and peaceful inside, like in a bear's den. For many, it was a place of peace and safety, where they could hide from the frightening, endless expanse of the plains. This small world was under complete human control, unlike the chaos outside. Children who were born or raised on the frontier perceived such houses quite differently from their parents. They considered them their natural habitat, playing happily on the grassy roofs and hiding in the niches of the walls. For them, it was not a symbol of poverty, but a whole magical world full of secrets and hidden corners. They knew no other life and were happy in these earthen fortresses. Gradually, as they got used to their new way of life, people began to decorate their earthen dwellings, trying to make them more comfortable. Housewives whitewashed the uneven walls with lime, hung bright calico fabrics, and placed framed photographs of relatives on the shelves. They desperately tried to turn the gloomy burrow into something resembling a normal, traditional home. This was important for preserving their human appearance and connection to their past life. The ability to maintain a clear mind and optimism in such conditions was as important a survival skill as the ability to shoot or plow the land. Those who broke down psychologically, unable to withstand the pressure of the walls in silence, usually gave up. They left the frontier and returned to the cities, abandoning their dreams of land. Only the most resilient remained, those who knew how to find joy in the little things. The history of these houses is, first and foremost, a story of the triumph of the human spirit over harsh material conditions. It is a story of the incredible ability of people to create a home and comfort in absolutely any conditions, even the most unbearable ones. It is a monument to those who were able to find a glimmer of hope, even in a dark earthen hole in the middle of a wasteland. They proved a simple truth in practice. A home is not beautiful walls with wallpaper, but a place where a family can spend the night and keep each other warm. And these primitive earthen shelters coped with their main task better than any royal palace. We have seen that earthen houses and dugouts were not just a sign of poverty, but a brilliant engineering response to extreme conditions. They used the laws of physics and local resources to ensure survival where conventional technologies failed. Thermal inertia, wind resistance, and the availability of materials made them ideal shelters for the pioneers of the Wild West. These modest, rough structures saved thousands of lives, allowing people to take root in a harsh land. They remind us that sometimes taking a step back to nature and simple solutions is the only way to move forward. What do you think? Could modern construction technologies surpass the effectiveness of a simple earthen rampart in conditions of complete isolation and lack of energy? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the channel to learn more about the forgotten survival technologies of the past.